So thank you guys for coming today. Just a few things of note. We have a Facebook page and we have a YouTube and an actual website where I keep things up to date. For those of you in the room, when you attend in person, at least 2 meetings. And in November, we'll do a drawing at our holiday party. And one of you or somebody else who maybe not here but has been here can win a SBE Members Plus membership on us. And then our next meeting will be October 16th. Mike Pappas will be in person. So sorry to you guys on Zoom, because we will not be able to do a Zoom on that one because he's gonna do his own presentation and stuff. We'll figure it out. And then something that just kind of came together today, November 15th. It's a Friday. It'll be the same time as usual, 11:30, the Bear Creek Golf Club. As we will have our holiday party there. Bear Creek Development, I think it's Development Corporation. I need to figure out the name. They are being kind enough to sponsor the event and make it free for all of us. So I'll get emails out soon for registration for that. And we want to thank Gary and excuse me, Capitol Space they're the ones who provided this lunch for us. So thank you guys very much. And with that, I will figure out how to do this because you think, yeah, see, James is on here. Let's see, James.
Yep. He's a good-looking one in the middle.
Do you want the change? Yes. All right, James is now the host, so we will let you have it.
Right between the eyes. Greetings, and as I said before, I'll be talking about war stories and some of our experiences from dealing with the FAA and with the FCC. Interference complaints in particular, since we're so close to these people in Washington who create rules for us, we often hear the war stories from their side as well. So we have some insight, hopefully. James, you saw from the bio, is a minor deity when it comes to things FAA. So, and we have a couple of surprises of things that a lot of broadcasters aren't aware of when dealing with the FAA, and you folks need to be aware of. So let's go to the first slide here. Interestingly, you think about interference caused to other stations, but the big thing is you can get interference to you or your operations. And there was a famous case, I guess it was Chicago, where somebody intercepted the STL link to a TV station and put something on the air at the TV station, the max headroom event or something like that. And there are other things that come up from time to time, people getting in the way of an STL for a radio or a TV station. Often it's ducting that nails you, but sometimes you can have some mischief makers. But usually you hear about things that you're causing to other folks, such as members of the public who are not happy about they're not getting their programs or their audio. But we've also seen stuff where homes, weird things happening in people's homes, like a gas fireplace playing the local Korean radio station. That was an amusing event, and it was just basically a dioding effect. But the fun things we get to research. Laboratories in particular are kind of nasty places for interference because they use a lot of unbalanced circuitry, and some of their wiring practices are pretty hideous. So it's amazing where you get interference complaints from. So let's go on to the next one here. Your friends at the FCC are really the primary source of talking to you about issues to and from the station. Their charter is to investigate, resolve, and to help out and, if necessary, take enforcement action. But depending on who you're picking on with interference and or alleged problems you're causing, other federal agencies can show up, say, hi, we care about you and we need to talk about this. If things get really ugly, they'll call in federal marshals. So it can escalate rather quickly if people don't play nice in the sandbox. Next one. 2 stages of complaints. And by the way, please jump in with questions, comments, quibbles, disagreements. I don't mind. And that's part of the fun of this. 2 important benchmarks before the station is licensed. When you're in the application for CP stage or in the application for license stage, that's where you can lob complaints into the FCC and file informal objections or formal objections. They're usually in the form of pleadings. If you go on the FCC Daily Digest, there's usually a page of pleadings of the day, and you can see who's complaining about what stuff where. If you want to sit there eating popcorn and look at other people's misery, that's where you can see the public record of folks that are disagreeing with proposals that are out there. Once a license is issued and a certain number of days has passed, usually it's 30-ish, we'll call it 40 just for a snail mail error, you're pretty well home free, and the complaints then have to go to the Consumer Inquiries and Complaints Center. That process is glacial. So if you have a complaint about another broadcaster in the area causing your problems, then direct communication isn't working, then you have to go the route of the Consumer Inquiries and Complaints Center. And that's a lot of hoop jumping and gnashing of teeth. And if any of you have ever gone through that, you'll see that it's not easy, which means if the member of the general public goes through the FCC, it'll take a while before we would hear of it. Next one. If you pick on a federal agency with some misbehaving transmitter, that gets real quick attention from the FCC and others. What we've run into over here in the East Coast, where there's a lot of navigation stuff, is problems with Coast Guard frequencies, problems with communications in Coast Guard areas, Border Patrol DHS operations. If you're picking on an instrument landing system, surveillance, radar, communication systems, all those get attention. The really fun ones are DHS and Secret Service. They have no sense of humor, as does law enforcement. And if you start to pick on their systems, you'll hear probably from them first. If you're lucky, you hear from the FCC first. And usually they're fairly demanding. It's like, okay, take it off like now. And this is where you have to put on your statesman hat and be as nice as you can be cooperative, and take notes and say, okay, we hear you, we understand. We don't show anything going on here. We'll check into it. Tell me what's going on. And try to keep it nice, even if they're not nice, because you're probably being recorded. And also, if the people there hear that you are trying to be cooperative and you're trying to be helpful, that makes it go a little bit easier, and it tightens down things a bit, so they're not so willing to come in and say, okay, off now, sort of things. As soon as you can, let station management know, your director of engineering, the station manager, the owner, that guess what, the federal people are interested in us and we're dealing with it, but they need to know because they ultimately are the person responsible for all of this. Next one. Going on the FCC's website is always an adventure, and some of the slides on there saying who's who and who's who, particularly in enforcement, are not correct. But the bottom line is the Field Bureau or the Enforcement Bureau are the ones that be reaching out to you. The head of the Enforcement Bureau's Field Division is Mike Rhodes. He used to work with us here, and Mike has been on both sides of that fence. He has been a consulting engineer. He's been in radio stations, and he's had a lot of experience on that side and helping people that are causing trouble. Now he gets to look at people who are causing trouble. Again, field agents are often very helpful. They're engineers for the most part. Sometimes you run into a lawyer, but by and large, you have engineers and technicians that are pretty interested in, as an engineer, solving the problem. So again, being combative or being evasive when there's an interference complaint is a bad idea. So try to be nice and take a lot of notes. Next one. The things that are less scary is if the local cab company is upset with you or somebody else is upset with you. The federal government guys can scare you, but an upset local hospital is just noisy, but still serious. Perceived issues, because sometimes there's not really an issue. It's not something you're doing. It could be something else totally unrelated to you. Again, put on your nice hat, but you'll be talking to people in homes, offices, hospitals, hospitals are sticky because that's safety of life, and they have a lot of wireless systems to hook up to their patients as they're wandering the hallways. If you ever had the misfortune of being in a hospital in a serious way, you have all kinds of telemetry hooked to you and hooked to your gown, and you're wandering around, and there's a little Wi-Fi things in the ceilings, and all your vitals are going across. And if you're interfering with those, they get real concerned, particularly in the intensive care units. Schools and colleges, piano labs in the colleges, sometimes they're very sensitive to high levels of RF, particularly AM, believe it or not. Industrial plants, scientific research centers and labs, those use the worst wiring practices I've ever seen. And I say that with some authority because one of my sons is a PhD, and his laser lab was a rat's nest, and I squawked and it got better. But so you will find that some of the most learned institutions have the crummiest techniques. And of course, recreational users, ham CBers, that sort of thing. Sometimes they get very righteously indignant if they think you're messing with their receivers. The complaints can vary, and that's the problem, particularly as we do more and more digital radio and television. It's hard for the general public to understand that it's your station. So digital signals are usually just noise. If they can decode your audio or your pictures, then they know it's you. But if it's just noise, they're not quite sure. But broadcasters are very visible. We have big fancy buildings in many cases and lots of towers, and we're visible, and also we tend to answer the phone and answer emails and answer social media. So we're often the first stop for, gee, I've got a problem. This can be kind of cool because you can make a friend if you do it right. Sometimes you just get called by the little old lady down the street who's lonely and needs to be talked to. Oh my God. But again, it's a chance to be nice, make a friend, try to go, we'll get to how many people should show up, but don't go alone to somebody's house to try to help them. And maybe you need one person to deal with a problem, one person to deal with a complainant, and one person to admire the pictures of their dogs. And that goes a long way, believe it or not. I mentioned at the bottom of this, junctions with rectifications. You can have people's bathroom plumbing talking to them. They hear when they flush the toilet at the AM radio station. That was amusing as hell. It had to do with the way the toilet pipe was grounded. God help us. Air conditioning ducts rectifying the radio station. The lights when you're very close to an AM site varying with modulation. As I said, somebody's very fancy gas fireplace was playing Korean music, much to their distress. So it's amazing the sort of things you run into, and it's a lot of just a practical cleanup sort of thing. Forms of interference, you folks all know this, but there's the classic intermodulation, where 1, 2, and 3 transmitters get together or more and start to have a party in somebody's broadband cavity or in a nonlinear place, and you get an undesired amount of interference on somebody else's frequencies. Usually there are mountaintop sites, which you're familiar with in the Denver area. We see a lot of connection issues, loose bolts on towers, problems with loose connections of siding on buildings. I told a story yesterday to the LA chapter about one of my former business partners was an FCC inspector, and he had to take a bosun's chair down the side of the old World Trade Center to find a loose metal panel, and he can have that job. Thank you very much. But so rappelling down the side of a building is not my idea of a good time. But again, it's something as silly as a loose connection to something totally unrelated to you can make your signal rectify or propagate in strange places. The other possible suspects are co-channel and adjacent channel interference. Usually that's regulated by allocation. So this will be an atmospheric effect ducting, or somebody who's living in sin at their transmitter site and something's wrong. And harmonics, we all need to scratch our head and invoke various deities. It's a multiple of the fundamental frequency. So what's it? Several multiples of your TV station or your FM station land on the 700 megahertz LTE cellular radio band, and all of a sudden you're the bad guy, even though it's really not the broadcaster's fault. This is the subject for a separate seminar, but it's usually the FCC badly regulated that transition. And yes, they are going to have interference from us. And this, however, you can use the rule. If you entertain, the short version of it is, if you entertain the complainant, and talk nice to them and show them how to use a spectrum analyzer and document that you are not living in sin, that your transmitter is not radiating things in excess of what you're allowed to in the rules, then they're the last in and they have to deal with it, not you. And there's been some case law that has made this very clear in spite of how much they beat their chest and holler at you. Just document the devil that your facility is working right. You can show them on your spectrum analyzer through your sampler port that your FM transmitter is in compliance with the rules, and you've pretty well, other than being nice and being cooperative, have gotten your bacon out of the fire there. Next one. Brute force overload. You have a lot of signal and people are going past your antenna system where there's a lot of signal, and you blanket their reception in their cars and their portable radios and their portable TVs. You drown them out, overwhelm the radio or the TV. And the FCC has been fussed at so much about this that they put special rules in place for AM and FM, but there are none in place for television, which I find odd. Sidebar, though a lot of us are looking at our IBOC power and looking at the sidebands and gee, maybe we can make it like -10 and cover the known planet. When you increase your IBOC power, sometimes that will cause a blanketing problem. We've had a recent case with a client, they wiped out a section of interstate when they went up to the maximum allowable power, and they had to back it back down, much to their regret. So again, when you're increasing IBOC power, keep your eyes and ears open for that, and hopefully you don't run into a particular problem. Next one. Rules and regulations, the Bible according to the FCC. Again, for AM, there's their blanketing rule, which defines it as 1 volt per meter, 1,000 millivolts per meter contour. Anything that level or higher will make radios misbehave. The FCC gives you a get out of jail card. I think it's what, 7324G says if you have fewer than so many people within the blanketing contour, don't worry about it. And more than that, then you need to worry about it and swear that you're going to be a good Boy Scout. A similar thing exists for the FM side, 73318, and that's 115 dBm contour. The interesting thing is they lump AM and FM under one basket case of 73318, B, C, and D. And James, we can go to the next slide, and I will spare you the eye chart. Basically, whenever you do something new or you change something, this opens the clock for blanketing interference complaints. You have to satisfy the complaints within a 1-year period. The satisfaction is at no cost to the complainant. The rule says that mobile receivers, non-RF devices, garage door openers, baby monitors are excluded, but if they squawk loud and long enough, the FCC is going to lean on you to try to take care of people. An important point, if you're co-locating with another station, again, you're the last one in, you're responsible for solving the problems. If you are going together at a site with somebody, you both are building at the same time, you share the responsibility. You both are the last in. So that's sort of the chain of complaint. Next one. After the 1-year period, the financial obligations to help pay for filters and traps and that sort of thing goes away, and you're just required to give technical information or assistance. But the FCC in their documents, and by the way, at the bottom, there's go researching. Google is a wonderful tool for research. DA 08407A1 and 08366A1 kind of expands with the 318 stuff and where that came from. It's basically they want you to deal with providing information on how to correct things, but don't touch things. Give them the complainant diagrams and descriptions of what to do, help them find where to get repair parts. Then you have to pay for it if you're within that 1-year period. You can't just refer them to the equipment manufacturer. Let's go to the next one here. And the FCC, if they send you a letter, a formal letter saying, hey, we have a problem with you, you got 60 days to deal with it. And you have to respond to them in writing. And the gospel here is these 5 points beneath. You have to document the day of the complaint, what was involved, whether it's in the blanketing contour or not, the dates and descriptions of what you did to solve the problem and whether or not it's been resolved. And they want you to have a map. So get out your crayons and you have to do a map showing the transmitter site, the location of the blanketing contour, and the locations of the complainants. And you really have to document to the FCC, here's what we did, here's who's involved, here's what transpired. And that lets them know that you're trying to be cooperative. So it is a written requirement for them. Next one. Here's a big deal. Everybody needs to play nice. And this is in the rules, it's in the dockets I gave you. The complainants have to cooperate with you. You have to cooperate with them. If they don't cooperate with you, then the FCC, if they're feeling generous, can say, you know, you guys did what you need to do. Go away, complainant. You haven't cooperated. If either party engages in gamesmanship and delays and excuses, then the FCC will say, okay, forget it. This is done. So that's the good news, is the FCC, on most cases, tries to take the side of being reasonable. So that's where you are there. Next bit. Real world advice. And again, you guys are very quiet. This is very scary. If you get a complaint, let the suits know right away and pass along whatever guidance you have, such from a webinar like this or from the rules that you have a handy copy of, because this stuff can get ugly real fast. And you know about social media and how fast you can be blamed for something you didn't do. So damage control, appeasing people, trying to make them know that you care and you're going to take care of them is important before it rises to FCC complaint or lawsuits. Again, and I'll repeat this 1,000 times, respond cordially and professionally, no matter how off the wall the complainant is. Try to be a nice person, grit your teeth, let them know that, yes, we're taking you seriously. Yes, I know your parakeet is sounding the radio station, fine. But let them know you're going to try to help them solve the problem and start a logbook, take notes. And here are some of the hints there: date, time, name, where they are, if they'll give you the address. Is it a certain time of day? Under what conditions? Is it raining when it happens? Was the wind blowing? Again, if wind's blowing, maybe it's a loose connection on a gutter, which is dioding, things like that. Try to get their contact information, because if they don't let you contact them again, how can you help them? Will they let you visit to observe and help remediate? Again, take actions, note the actions, summarize conversations, take notes. It's a pain to do this, but do that. And make sure that the station's legal counsel, FCC, Communications Council, is involved. If they give you advice, follow it. If you disagree with advice, offline, let them know you disagree with the advice. So here's sort of the real world side of it. Next one there. Do not go to somebody's house or apartment alone, because you don't know what kind of whack jobs are there and what they might allege. So I wouldn't do that. Bring another station employee or two as a witness to what's going on and what didn't go on. We all are hands-on. Try not to touch their equipment. You probably will, but don't, because if you do, they'll say that you broke it, and then you got to deal with providing them a new one. And by the way, sometimes the fix for a bad situation is the station's going to buy them a new something that doesn't have interference, and that may be cheaper than consultants and your time and lawyers' time. So that's an option. Don't tell them that what you'll fix it or you won't fix it. Just say you'll help them fix it. So if you recommend an outside company like Joe Snuffy's TV repair shop, if there's any left, make sure the station's on board if you want to pay for them to do the repair. If the station's not on board with that, you can tell them, hey, you can try calling these guys and see if they can help you, but be careful not to obligate the station. And big time important thing, make sure that whoever responds to your social media, email, and telephones at the station are sensitized to these things may come up. Respond cordially and professionally, because they are the first contact. It's like with any business, the person who answers the phone is the business. So if you have some intern or a high school kid answering the phone and they mouth off to somebody who is mad or upset, that's a bad start. So anytime there's an interference complaint for the radio TV station, preach the gospel of cooperation, being cordial, being professional. Yes, we're going to help you. Let me take your information. Somebody will reach out to you. It'll probably be within X days or X minutes. Just let them know you care. That is a big deal. And make sure that person takes a written record of all the details volunteered and what was said and who they are. So that's a big one. And a final one here. This is our Bob Clinton showing that he does work. Real world advice. It could be your fault. It could be that your station has a problem. I know it's hard to believe, but you really could have something going wrong. So kind of wander around. Do you hear the problem at the studio? Do you hear it at the transmitter? Do you hear it in other places around town? Do you hear it where the complainant's house is? Have there been other complaints like this in the past? Where were they? So it's a little bit of forensic checking. Go to the transmitter site. Has anything changed in the transmitter? Are they reading slightly different? Is the exciter saying ugly things? Reflected power changes. Look at VisWire. If there is standing wave indication is bouncing around with modulation, particularly in FM or in STLs, that's not normal. Something's unhappy. It might be somebody's trying to talk to you and say, hey, I've got an issue. Of course, our old friend cabinet leakage. Is there a door that's popped open or an interlock that's gotten kind of funny and letting the door be ajar? Obvious things, look at the tower and transmission line. Look at the tower, you see arcing. I had a case here in the Washington area where they were having complaints, and luckily we're in the region. We drove over and I drove into the parking lot, looked up, and there's this big blue arc. I said, think I see your problem at my hourly rate. And they could have looked up and said, oh, and they were getting some funny jumping around a VisWire, but they were on the air, so they were happy. I said, no, you better quench that and go to a backup antenna site before you have a burnout that's worse. So again, look around. Is anything different? Has anything else been changed in your market? One of your competitors or people that share the site, have they done something differently? I'm thinking of intermod changes. And find a spectrum analyzer somewhere, borrow one from another station. Say, is there something in the spectrum that looks different? So that's sort of the bum's rush through this, because I want to give James a lot more time because he's got more important things to talk about. But before we jump into James's half, anybody have any questions or comments or war stories that would be helpful for the group? Amanda, there are crickets. Okay, so there are no problems in Denver. That's good. So, well,
Fred just said you probably don't want to start with war stories. We might be here all day.
it's true. But we've all been there, and we can all learn from the war stories and what were the best practices and what solved problems. But mostly it's people skills. And engineers are great with people skills, so we're cool. We got this. Okay, well, now we'll bump it over to James, who's way smarter than I am, and he can talk to you about some fun stuff.
Thanks, Gary. Appreciate it. And thank you, everybody, for letting us impose on your time today. Certainly appreciate you allowing us this platform to go through and talk about all things interference and also FAA. So I'll start by saying that if there's any thoughts, questions along the way from anybody, don't hesitate to of course, raise a hand or virtual hand, if you will, to ask the question. Always happy to address things as we go through the presentation. By way of introduction, my name is James Scott. I'm one of the senior project managers at Capitol Airspace Group. I've been with the company now for just over 6 years. Started off at the company on our analytical team, and that's essentially the side of our house that conducts all our various diligence analyses, predominantly or for the most part around airspace, but then we've since then continued to grow and expand into other areas such as spectrum work as well. So at any rate, after a year of doing that at Capitol Airspace, I moved over to our advocacy team, or essentially project management team. So I work directly with developers, station managers, et cetera, and ultimately work with those individuals to determine, one, does their project even need a coordinator be filed with the FAA? And two, if it does, what concerns, problems, risks do we see that could potentially come up as a part of the FAA's aeronautical study process? So,
hey, James.
Yeah.
I think you're on Gary's mic, so it's not actually like we can hear you, but the video is not going to you.
I should. Is my screen still sharing? Do you guys see the presentation yet, or no?
Yeah, we can see that.
Okay, gotcha. And I mean, I'm happy. We can always switch. Gary can mute everything on his side, and I can always put it on mine if you guys prefer also to have the video of myself as well.
Yeah, if you don't mind doing that, that way we can, because it's just hard, we have, you're very small, because we have to have the whole gallery right now.
James is small. That's the first time we've heard that. Stand by one.
Yeah, we'll mute his microphone and go from there. Sorry for the echoes.
That should have done it.
And then mute your mic too. On that.
Gosh, you want everything. It should be good.
And okay. Yep. All right. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
Yep, you're good to go.
Yeah, you
Great.
sound better.
All right, perfect. Sounds good. Awesome. So we'll at any rate, just by quick introduction of our company as well, Capitol Airspace Group, we've been around for gosh, nearly 15 years at this point, founded by our owner, Ben Doyle. We essentially work with various developers all across the United States to include building developers, wind developers, station managers, antenna tower developers, et cetera. And ultimately, we work with those individuals to identify what risks, what concerns, if any, could come up in the FAA's aeronautical study process. And so we work by peeling back all those layers of the onion of airspace to determine what those issues might be, and then ultimately provide forecasting, timing, et cetera, with developers so that they have a good understanding of what the risks are, how long it may take to resolve their concern, and then ultimately to continue on through the FAA's aeronautical study process. So with that said, for today, I plan on covering 4 different items. Some of these we're going to breeze through pretty quickly. Other ones we can certainly stay on a little bit longer, and certainly happy to answer any questions along the way. Nevertheless, what we'll cover are the governing publications and orders that the FAA has for this aeronautical study process. 2 is determining when do you have to submit your project to the FAA. So essentially their notice criteria. When is it required to have to submit to them? Next is the FAA's aeronautical study process. So assuming that you do file with them, what does that process look like? Approximately how long can it be on the short end, on the high end, et cetera? And then finally, we'll bring it home with the FAA's OEAAA, or Obstruction Evaluation and Airspace Analysis portal, with just a couple quick highlights of some areas of resources that might be extremely helpful to you and or others on your respective teams. So to start is first the governing publications and orders, or as Gary said most affectionately on his side of the house, the governing documents or Bibles, if you will, for each of these areas of interest. The first is the FAA, or Code of Federal Regulations, 14 CFR Part 77. That's the safe and efficient use and preservation of navigable airspace. It's essentially the CFR that outlines, 1, when you need to file with the FAA, and 2, essentially what that regulatory process is at a high level, of course, but what that regulatory process is as a result of filing with the FAA, and of course, some of the barometers and metrics that the FAA uses in order to make a decision. Taking that CFR and going in at a much greater detail is the 7400.2 PAPA, the Procedure for Handling Airspace Matters. That is essentially the deeper dive of the FAA's aeronautical study process. Of course, on a much deeper level, what are the various steps? What are the additional details that go into the decision-making of either, 1, issuing a determination of no hazard, which is essentially the golden ticket that everybody wants, or conversely, the determination of hazard. If there is a concern, an airspace issue, electromagnetic interference issue, what are the essentially parameters that the FAA has to abide by in order to make those decisions? So under 14 CFR Part 77.9 is the FAA's outline of when you do or do not need to file with the FAA. And so that's essentially what we'll dive into here. First in the order is, of course, it states that if you're a project located or co-located on airport property, doesn't matter how tall, how short you are, whether you're a permanent structure or temporary structure, you must file with the FAA always, no matter what, doesn't matter. Second is there are sloping surfaces that emanate up and away from all public use airports and all public use heliports and military use airports, at a ratio most conservatively of 100 to 1. So for every 100 feet laterally, that surface goes up 1 foot vertically, and it can go out as far as 20,000 feet from a facility. So hypothetically, if you're a 150-foot tall structure and you're 10,000 feet from an airport, more likely than not, you're going to exceed that surface. And the reason I say more likely than not is because that surface starts at the runway end elevation. So if technically 10,000 feet away, you're actually on significantly lower elevation, you may be a 150-foot tall structure and not have to file. Or conversely, maybe you're 10,000 feet away and you're only a 50-foot structure, but you're on significantly higher terrain. It's going to push you through that surface, and therefore you're going to have to file with the FAA. Nevertheless, that's another instance, of course, where you would have to submit is if you exceed that 100-to-1 surface. The next is if you're a structure greater than 200 feet above ground level, anywhere in the entire United States, doesn't matter how close or how far you are from an airport, you're going to have to file your project no matter what. And again, that goes for both permanent and or temporary structures.
And cranes and jib poles.
Correct, exactly. Yeah, cranes, jib poles, transmission lines, everything that you could think of under the sun, truthfully. Anything, of course, specific more towards these types of project structures that you could think of that would all likely have to get filed, assuming you meet one of these criteria here. The next one that we label as number 4 here is if the FAA ever asks you to file. We say it in this manner because it's less likely that the FAA is going to come out to your site and say, hey, what are you working on? What construction do you have here? Oh, did you file that? Yes, no. It's more likely that somebody is going to get a call from the airport or get a call from another entity that is probably in some instances on behalf of the FAA that's going to say, hey, did you file with the FAA? Hey, you probably should consider doing so. So regardless, we would say, of course, if anybody from the FAA comes to you and says, did you file, or yes, you need to file, then of course you're federally obligated to at that point. But beyond that, there's also a tool on the FAA website, a notice criteria tool, that essentially all these surfaces that are described here are culminated in this tool. And if you punch in the coordinates for your project location, the site elevation, maximum structure height, the output of that tool will literally tell you you do or do not need to file with the FAA. And our belief as a company is that if you run the tool and it says you need to file, therefore now you are federally obligated to have to file with the FAA. The final item, and this is more specific towards this industry.
Before you go there,
Oh, yeah,
let me
go for it.
interject. If you go to the FCC website, there's something called TOWAIR, TOWAIR. It's their screening tool for antenna structure registration. If you trip TOWAIR and it says you don't need to register the tower or go to the FAA, then done. Print a copy of that, put it in your file, move on, birds sing. If it says no, this structure might require FAA review, then boom, you have to go tell the FAA. The FCC's TOWAIR screening tool is much more relaxed than the FAA tool. The FAA tool will nail you on things that the FCC tool won't. So use that bit of knowledge as you see fit, but the FAA tool is the one that if it says you got to notify, then you have to notify. So, sorry.
No, that's perfect. That's good. And the last item that I'll mention for number 5 is if there's any sort of alterations to existing structures, whether or not you're adding height to an existing antenna tower, or whether it's physically moving itself, or, and probably most importantly here, if you are adding to the tower, adding an antenna and or altering any of the existing frequencies and or power to the antenna, then it would obligate you to have to file with the FAA again. And that's codified under 14 CFR Part 77.7C or 7 Charlie. And it says specifically, it's in little print here, but it says specifically if you propose construction or alteration that is also the subject of the licensing requirements of the FCC, you must submit to the FAA on or before the date that the application is filed with the FCC. So it's certainly important that if you have an existing structure, but you're looking to change it and or add to it, if it requires coordination with the FCC, it's going to require coordination with the FAA. So just something for everybody to keep in their back hip pocket.
And this is a minefield because you have existing structures with FMs and other radiating elements on it. Any changes should be notified to the FAA. Well, this tower was 1,000 years old and was never notified. That may be, but if you make a change, technically, you're supposed to tell the FAA about it. because FM frequencies in particular can pick on the localizers for the instrument landing systems at an airport. And a lot of these, it's an intermod issue, and they want to screen for it. And they can say, well, gee, unless you can cure the predicted intermod, we're not going to grant you determination of no hazard. And if you have no DNH, then the FCC will not process your application. You will not get an ASR. So nobody detonated on that one. LA exploded on that one.
Any other thoughts, questions before we proceed? All right, crickets, hearing none, we'll keep going.
I do have one quick question. So, looking at that slope, I'm thinking that there's some place where somebody could look up each airport and see what the slope is.
There's not a resource that's going to give you, well, I'm sorry, let me back up. Under 14 CFR Part 77, it's going to outline based on the traits of the airport, runway length, for instance, it'll tell you what that slope should be, whether it's 100 to 1, 50 to 1, or for heliports, it's actually a 25 to 1 slope. So depending on the runway length determines exactly what the exact slope is. However, there's not a resource out there other than just publicly available airport data about runway length, where you'd have to essentially do the math between the runway location, runway end elevation, plus the slope. So you'd have to do all that trig yourself, which I think is fine, I think in all instances. But the quicker resource to determine whether or not you need to file is going to be that FAA tool, where you punch in the coordinates of your project, its location, and it will tell you based on your proposed height how much you exceed that slope, if at all. It may say that you're underneath it, or the output of the tool could say that you're in proximity to navigational aid facilities, and not because you exceed those slopes, but because you're close to those nav aids that you have to submit to the FAA for their review. So otherwise, in the absence of those options, that's where, certainly Capitol Airspace could always assist with a project, or even quickly vet a project with somebody and just quickly look and go, yeah, okay, based on this, you likely have to file, or no, yeah, you definitely don't. But unfortunately, there's not a publicly available one-stop shop that's going to give you all that information other than just simply running the FAA tool.
I think part of the reason why I was asking that was because most projects are going to be at somewhat of a skew to the actual runway. So if your runway is 036 and you're 051, is your slope different than if you were actually at 036?
No, it's so essentially that slope emanates all up and away from all sides of the runway itself. So even if you're to the side of the runway, you could still get caught up in that surface and have to file. And I definitely want to be specific and say that just because you have to file with the FAA does not mean that your project is necessarily going to be a concern with the FAA. It just means that they want to review it and adjudicate and make sure that there isn't an issue.
Thank you.
Yes, sir. Very good question too. Keep them rolling. So, this slide here really just affirms what my final bullet point was on the previous slide, talking about, of course, changes, heights, frequencies, all that good stuff. That's just memorialized in an example of a determination of no hazard for an antenna tower.
Yeah, look at the underline there. This is a happy determination of no hazard. And the underlying text there says any changes in frequency power will void this. So if you're on Mosen Grayson Tower Company's tower and they have everybody else on there and you volunteer to change your power or your frequency or your location, the FAA is going to want to know about it. If it's not disclosed, that action will void the determination of no hazard for the entire tower. And this is kind of a bone of contention for a lot of people, but that's the rule. And the FAA doesn't have authority over broadcasters, but they sure have authority over determinations of no hazards, and the FCC looks at those and says you can have an ASR or not, and so forth. So be careful when you're proposing changes and look into it carefully.
So
jumping forward, if we assume that a project has to be filed with the FAA, what ultimately jumpstarts the FAA's aeronautical study process is filing FAA Form 7460-1 or 7460-1. That's the notice of construction or alteration, and that form is submitted for permanent structures and or temporary structures like cranes and all too. Regardless, when a project is filed with the FAA, it's managed by their Obstruction Evaluation Group, or OEG for short. And within that Obstruction Evaluation Group, there's actually two silos. One is the wind turbine side, and as its name suggests, they review all active or all proposed wind projects in the United States. And the other silo is the non-wind turbine side. These would be the folks that would review antenna towers or proposed buildings, stadiums, etc. And that's really the group of the Obstruction Evaluation Group that we would be privy to if, of course, there were any projects associated with your industry that we and or you guys would be coordinating with the FAA. Nevertheless, when you submit to the FAA, it's first going to go to somebody who's a technician. They're essentially the analyst on the FAA side. They're going to take the data that you provide them, frequency information, but also things like the latitude, longitude, site elevation, proposed structure height, and they're going to run it to ground and run it through their own traps, essentially make sure everything makes sense. That if you're saying you have a proposed project in Denver, that it's of course not plotting somewhere in Ohio. And so they'll run traps, and assuming everything looks good on their side, the technician will then punt the project over to the FAA specialist. The FAA specialist is like the project manager on the FAA side. They're the person that's going to disseminate the project to all these various offices, internal and external to the FAA to review. And then at the end of that review, it'll culminate with some communication to the project filer, whether that's Capitol Airspace or you guys as your own entity or somebody else. Nevertheless, the Obstruction Evaluation Group sees a very high frequency of cases on an annual basis, over 200,000 cases. That includes wind turbines, non-wind turbines, and then, of course, any other structures that exist out there as well. And the idea is, of course, that, much like other government entities, this is an understaffed but highly demanded office where there's a lot of throughput output that's demanded of them. But arguably, there could certainly be more people that could easily help them in order to get things turned around much quicker. Nevertheless, the intent of the Obstruction Evaluation Group, and as the whole portion of this FAA aeronautical study process, is their ultimate goal is to determine whether or not a proposed structure, permanent or temporary, is a hazard, yes or no. If no, then you get a determination of course, no hazard, like we talked about before. It's the golden ticket. It's what everybody wants. However, if there is any sort of obstruction to physical airspace, or if a proposed structure is creating some level of electromagnetic interference, that's where the FAA could issue a determination of hazard. And that's, of course, the big no-no. Nobody wants a determination of hazard. And specifically for any projects associated with the FCC, you're not going to be able to continue through the FCC process if you have a determination of hazard. Nevertheless, beyond the FAA's decision-making in a determination of hazard or no hazard, they're also going to include, for a determination of no hazard, they're also going to include marking and lighting requirement and or recommendations, meaning that, of course, if you're approved and depending on your height, you may have to have just a red light on top and paint, or perhaps mid-level lighting and a light on top, both for daytime and nighttime operations, etc. Beyond that, the FAA process and the FAA as a whole are very explicit in saying that their determinations of no hazard are not a permit. They're not a standalone. The FAA itself makes a decision on your project, but they do not have any sort of regulatory authority or land use authority over your project, meaning that your only obligation to the FAA is to file your project, to propose it to them. Beyond that, it's really other external circumstances that actually necessitate having to get that determination of no hazard. For instance, the FCC requires a determination of no hazard. Other entities such as insurance, financing, and other types of permitting, they may require a determination of no hazard, which is why it could be, or why it's ultimately of most people's goal to get that determination. Otherwise, if you were just somebody who is completely and independently funded, and take the antenna tower out of the equation, and let's just call it a freestanding structure, if you own property just off an airport and you didn't need insurance, financing, any sort of permitting, you could build a 1,000-foot tall structure right off the end of a runway. And technically it is legal by all accounts. It may be extremely frustrating and cause a lot of heartburn and grief for somebody, but technically it is legal. Because your obligation would only be to file with the FAA, not necessarily because you need that determination of no hazard. So long story short, it's just one of those important little details to make, that so long as you're fulfilling your obligation to file, then you've checked that box. But in most, if not all other instances beyond that, you still have to get that determination of no hazard for any number of reasons. Gary, go ahead.
Let me jump in with a couple of information points for you. If you're curious about, is something going to be a problem with the FAA, you can file basically the same form, ask for a feasibility study, and they will look at it for you and give you an answer like this would be a hazard or this would not be a hazard. It's sort of an up-down thing. It does not bind you or bind them, but you can go ahead and do this to see, gee, am I going to be in trouble? So that's one point. The other point is if you want to change your lighting or your marking, your painting, 7460-1 is your ticket for requesting that. And particularly those of you who are in areas that are sensitive about avian mortality, bird kills from steady burning lights. Apparently birds are dumb, and steady burning lights attract them and they run into them at night and die, so somebody says. And yes, there is a biologist at the FCC that worries about this. So if you want to replace lights with flashing lights or other means that are less problematic for bird brains, you can talk to the FAA through the 7460 process. Some things are an automatic no way. Other things are, yeah, we can work with you. So that, again, there are processes. James, you probably, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, there's definitely an openness from the FAA to consider alternatives. The worst, as we always tell developers, the worst you can do is ask, and the worst that the FAA is going to say is no. And if we already have that worst case scenario answer and we're asking for a deviation from that, the worst case scenario is that we just go back to that original answer. So that may work for some, that may not work for others, and we understand it, but it's always at least worth it to put out an ask there. So,
and keep your paperwork from ancient times, from FAA and from FCC, and your marking and lighting paragraphs, which if anybody needs the Rosetta Stone for what those marking paragraphs mean from the FCC, let me know, because it's not clear. But if you have something that was granted in 1940, it won't meet the lighting and marking standards of 2024, but it's still legal for you to keep the old stuff on your tower, the old lighting, the old marking. New lights have to be LED, I guess, and it should be infrared goggle sensitive for helicopter pilots and other things. So there's a lot of new requirements that you don't have to have unless you start to change something. When you change something, if you're going from one form of light to another, then you may need to ask the FAA's permission.
yep, and that's the biggest point, is when you go to change or alter your existing structure, that's when you're ultimately going to be on the hook for something new. So,
and one other login point for you is if you're building a new tower, it's 1,000 feet tall, and you have a gin pole or you have a big crane used to help lift it the final few feet, that exceeds 1,000 feet, well, then you're going to have that crane studied. And if you don't get the crane studied and approved, you can't build it. We see this in buildings a lot, where anything taller than the structure has to be also studied and approved.
yep. So to continue off of this, this is just a basic summary of the FAA's aeronautical study process, and we'll hit really the high notes of it. And then, of course, if there's any thoughts, questions along the way, don't hesitate, let us know. But to ultimately jumpstart this process, as we previously discussed, you have to file the FAA Form 7460-1, the notice of presumed construction and or alteration, or of course, the use of temporary equipment. Once you submit that form to the FAA, it is going to jumpstart their initial review of the project. That's where they peel back all the layers of the onion of airspace to determine what concerns, if any, might be as a result of triggering this entire process. The FAA's initial review on the short end could be a matter of days, if not even just as little as a couple of weeks. On the high end, it could stretch months and months and months. The reason being, of course, is the more risk, the more concerns you add to the mix, the longer it's going to take the FAA to review. Whereas, of course, if we're talking a structure that has no interference and or very limited impact on airspace or electromagnetic interference, now that's going to be a much quicker review with lesser concerns, lesser impacts. Regardless, once that initial review concludes, the FAA is going to issue what are called notices of preliminary findings, or NPFs for short. Those NPFs are the FAA's way of saying, hey, here's what we have found. What do you want to do about it? And if, of course, there's any sort of concerns, no matter how benign and or grand they might be, the next steps after notices of preliminary findings are to request further study and public comment. Further study is where the FAA internalizes that concern even further to ultimately seek some level or hopefully some level of resolution, depending on that EMI impact and or physical airspace concern. And the public comment portion is really the FAA's way of fact checking themselves in their own review. Public comment goes out to typically the flying public. It's going to be the airport managers, airport owners, flight schools, any other operators located at the airport. But it can go out to other people like elected officials in that area as well. But what the public comment is not, is it is not an open forum for just any random citizen to comment on your project. They may get a hold of the FAA's public comment. They may choose to comment to the FAA, but the FAA is really only going to respond to anything that's based on sound aeronautical principles. So if somebody just says, well, I don't like this tower, I don't want this tower here, the FAA is not going to do anything about that. However, if somebody comments and says, I don't like this tower because I think it's actually impacting that airport over there, the FAA is going to look back at their notes and go, okay, well, did we review for this airport? Did we see what concerns, if any, could come up? Okay, yes, we did. Great. There are no impacts. Great. Then the next step of that process after further study and public comment is for the FAA to issue determinations of no hazard, or DNHs for short. That's going to be, of course, when the FAA has reached a favorable conclusion for the project. And assuming there's no concerns or no greater concerns from public comment, then the FAA can, of course, confidently make that decision. So once determinations of no hazard are issued, there are additional steps as a part of the FAA process. You can see in here that I have a petition period or pre-construction notices and all too. Those are just additional periods where either one, it's other opportunity for people to comment on the FAA's review, and or two, there are further obligations, further steps like submitting pre-construction notice, letting the FAA know that you're actually starting your project. And so those are other obligations that once you get the determinations of no hazard in hand, you're not necessarily just done there. There may still be those other steps as a part of the FAA process. So, and those other steps could be as little as just 40 days, or can sometimes be as much as still 3 or 4 months. So it's just a potential gotcha that you want to be careful of. So
That's an important point, is the NPF, don't ignore it.
yeah, NPFs, going back to the NPFs, when the FAA issues those, you actually only have 60 days to respond to the notices of preliminary findings. So you can't sit on those in perpetuity. You have to respond to the FAA within 60 days. And that response doesn't necessarily have to trigger the next step entirely. You could respond and say, hey, FAA, we received these. We're in a little bit of a holding pattern as we try to figure out our own next steps. Do you mind just holding these cases? And that's enough for the FAA to go, okay, you responded. That's fine. But if you just simply ignore the FAA for 60 days and you don't respond, and on the 61st day, you remember, oh, shoot, I needed to respond, there's always the potential that the FAA could have terminated those cases by that time. So it's very prudent to keep track of the 60 days once those notices are issued, and it's from the date of issuance. So 60 days from whatever the date is that it was issued. You want to make sure that you're just keeping track of that. And this is just I won't go into this in great detail and all, but this is really just to simply demonstrate where Capitol Airspace can fall into the equation for people. Really, at almost every point in the FAA's aeronautical study process, there's some level of an analysis, service, diligence study that we can conduct that could potentially get you to the next point of the process. And I would say that these are largely relevant and helpful in areas where you have a very contentious project. Whereas, of course, if you have a benign project, then, of course, there's probably not as much needed from us at that time. So all's to say that, you know, a lot of this stuff people may handle on their own, and that's perfectly fine. But if you ever hit a snag, that's where, of course, we could possibly be able to come in and help you guys out, or at least be able to assess and go, yeah, the FAA's language seems pretty damning the way that it's written, but you're actually okay if you just do X, Y, and Z. And, you know, you go off and just a quick pro bono assessment of your project, you're good to go. Or we may look at something and go, yeah, this is actually looking pretty grim. Here's why, and we talk about that. So at any rate, this is just simply to show how and where Capitol Airspace can fall into the equation. So what I want to do before I end this presentation here in the next couple of minutes is just kind of go through some basic examples of when you need to file with the FAA and versus when you do file with the FAA when you actually have risk. So what we normally do on a daily basis with our developers is, or really what it comes down to is on a daily basis with our developers, we're really looking at three different lenses of their project. One is, do you even need to file with the FAA? And that's this lowest surface, this notice criteria. Do you exceed the surface? Do you even need to file with the FAA? The second is, okay, maybe you have to file with the FAA, but do you exceed obstruction standard surfaces? These are the interim or middle surfaces in yellow there. You're allowed to exceed these surfaces, provided you go through public comment, provided you mark and light your structure. It's okay to exceed those, no big deal. The final assessment that we will do are things like critical airspace. These can be approaches and departures and en route airways and minimum vectoring and IFR altitude sectors, all these different types of airspace that overlie a project and you don't know it on a daily basis. Some of these segments of critical airspace, you actually are allowed to exceed. It's okay. There's actually inherent mitigation that the FAA can deploy to accommodate your project so that you can coexist with, of course, airspace, or you can at least coexist where there's no impact on airspace because you can mitigate it. But there might be other segments of airspace where it can't be mitigated and there is no path forward, or the path forward is going to take you 3 years before you actually get a favorable determination. Nevertheless, I lump all that into that critical airspace. Yes, no. So the first example I give is just this beautiful proposed brown box of a structure, a brown building. But assuming this building is below the FAA notice criteria, it doesn't need to be filed with the FAA. You're not exceeding the notification surface under 14 CFR Part 77. You don't need to file. You're okay. This second example is a structure that's a little bit taller. It actually exceeds the notice criteria surface, therefore it must be filed with the FAA. But because you don't exceed the obstruction standards and you certainly don't exceed or impact critical airspace, the FAA is likely just going to give you a determination of no hazard or a does not exceed, a DNE, because you don't impact those other two levels of airspace. And the only fly in the ointment here is this assumes that there's no electromagnetic interference. There is always the potential that if you're closer to an airport, you could be shorter, not impacting obstruction standards or critical airspace, but maybe you are close to a radar facility or a navigation aid facility or communication system where you are causing some sort of electromagnetic interference. Seemingly, that is a rare example, but worst case scenario, that can exist. Nevertheless, for all intents and purposes here, there's no electromagnetic interference. If you only exceed notice criteria, you get a determination of no hazard. The next example is you exceed notice criteria, therefore you have to file, and you also exceed the obstruction standard surfaces. So as a part of the FAA process, you must go through further study and public comment. But on the back end, because you don't impact critical airspace, you're going to receive that determination of no hazard. Just that as a part of that determination, you're going to have a petition period, and yes, you will have to mark and light your structure. And then the final example is really the worst case scenario, which is that yes, you have to file with the FAA. Yes, you do exceed obstruction standards, so you must go through further study, public comment. And thirdly, you do exceed critical airspace, so there is some sort of mitigation that must be deployed as a part of being able to accommodate your project. Or worst case scenario, there is no mitigation and you don't receive a determination of no hazard. So this is really kind of the third element that a project could fall into, and where, of course, you may have to engage in further discussions with the FAA and or if worst case scenario needed, utilize Capitol Airspace. Gary.
What are examples of mitigations?
So various examples of mitigations, depending on the type of segment or type of airspace that could be impacted, is raising minimum altitudes. So there could be minimum heights that an aircraft would normally fly, and you just have to raise that standard by 100 feet, 200 feet, however big the impact is, in order to accommodate both the building and, of course, ensure safety separation between the path of the aircraft and the known obstruction itself. There's other types of mitigation where you could literally carve out new elements of airspace and or redirect certain paths, approach procedures, departure procedures too. There's really a bunch of different options as far as mitigation is concerned.
Can you talk a little bit about when the airport makes changes and existing structures around no longer meet their criteria?
Yeah, so if an airport is looking to either one, expand their runway, and or two, to add instrument procedures to their airport or modify those existing instrument procedures, then the airport is working with the FAA to develop those procedures and to develop the quote minimums for those procedures, meaning the lowest and closest an aircraft can get to the airport before they make a decision to land, or the maximum climb gradient needed for an aircraft to depart that airport safely to ensure separation from any known obstructions. Regardless, if there's a modification to the airport, whether it's extending the runway or adding a procedure, they have to, meaning the airport and the FAA, have to take into consideration the existing obstacle environment. So if you have existing terrain, a mountain, a hill, or something to that effect in proximity to the airport, they must ensure that their airspace is modified in order to accommodate that obstruction. Additionally, if there are filed, approved, and constructed towers, antenna towers, or other structures out there, then they must again modify their airspace to accommodate those existing structures. What they can't do is they cannot develop airspace that all of a sudden is impacted by your existing structure that hypothetically, let's say, has been there for 20 years. The FAA can't make a new procedure where all of a sudden your structure is now impacting them. They would never create an environment like that. They would never conduct an operation like that. One, because there's an immediate safety of flight and risk concern there, and two, it's unfair to the owner of that antenna tower because they probably, if I had to assume, went through all the proper channels and have that favorable determination of no hazard already in the FAA system, or at the very least, that structure is already listed in the FAA's digital obstacle file. So it should all be taken into consideration as they're developing those procedures.
But if they don't know about you, if you haven't filed.
Yeah, and that's the worst case scenario, is that if you never filed your project with the FAA and there's no record of it in the FAA system, that's where, sure, you could be at potential risk. So it's always important to know for your structures, do you have existing history? Do you already have that FAA determination of no hazard? And perhaps the more specific nuance to all this is that back in the day when information was a little more primitive, coordinates, lat longs, all that good stuff were a little more primitive. We've seen plenty of cases where the FAA filed structure could be a couple feet to the side of the as-built antenna structure, or it could be hundreds of feet away. So if there's a situation where, sure, there's some history to that structure, but it ended up not being built to the exact specifications that were submitted to the FAA, technically by the book, the FAA would say that you need to correct and or essentially refile your structure as an existing structure, but with the FAA because it's not in the correct position.
I think in my mind, the word eminent domain kept popping up. You know, in the case of a large municipal airport wanting to make some material change to their runway system, and you're in their way.
Yeah, I think from an FAA standpoint, that would be exceedingly rare. That is probably more of a local issue, where you would have to probably handle that with the county and or municipality, whoever essentially governs the airport. I'm sure it's always possible that eminent domain could be applied, but if you have enough existing structures out there, it's really hard to do that. And a perfect example that I could point to where it's exceedingly rare that would happen is actually in San Diego. If you have there's aircraft that are heading west, so coming in from the east, landing west in San Diego, and there's a rather large 7-story parking structure that you would fly over as you're coming in to land on the runway there. And that parking structure has been the bane of San Diego's existence, or has been the bane of San Diego Airport, since that parking structure existed. And the reason why is because that parking structure prevents San Diego the ability to have lower minimums for their pilots to come in and land. And it's also created at their airport what's called a displaced threshold. It's essentially reduced the available landing area for the pilots to land. And San Diego has been trying to, for honestly decades at this point, try to get rid of that parking structure to no success still to this day. And so it's not, it certainly is not a foolproof example where eminent domain could still exist somewhere else. But I would say that the case for them to do that would have to be, there would have to be an argument of safety and a necessity of safety that they would have to prove above and beyond why your existing structure just couldn't still exist. So I don't know, Gary, if you have any additional thoughts on that, but it's not outside the realm of possibilities, but I don't think it's something, one, that the FAA would push for. It's something more at the local level that would probably be contentious or a battle for you.
Yeah, it'll be more of a local law issue and zoning issue. I don't think you're going to have a problem with the FAA.
You just talked to it. You can hear me, James?
Yep.
You brought up San Diego, and I just have to ask. It used to be that when you landed there, you looked off the wingtip on the starboard side, and you could look into an office building. And then one day, that office building just disappeared. Was that a matter of them removing the office building for the airport, or did it just go away kind of on its own? Do you happen to know that?
I don't. I'd be very curious. I mean, I'll tell you what, it's something I'd be happy to research just for giggles and run that to the ground just to see. Because San Diego is one of those areas where it's so, you come over Bankers Hill when you're landing from the east to the west. And you have downtown, of course, over on that side that you're looking out. So I know that there's a lot of structures that are close, but if I had to guess, I don't think the removal of that building had anything to do with the airport, just what we know of the existing environment and the existing airspace out there right now. I'd be hard pressed to say at this point that it was anything that the airport caused.
One other quick question. I'm temporarily unmuted. This is complicated. It's not good with technology. With the recent Supreme Court decisions having to do with administrative law, do you see an impact in either the FCC or FAA rules? Do you see people taking this to court? Because clearly a large amount of this is arbitrary. I mean, 100 to 1, 99 to 1, what's the difference kind of thing. And have you seen any of that kind of litigation?
We haven't seen any of that litigation really firsthand at this point, but we also acknowledge based on that ruling that it could become an issue. So it's, details to follow as far as any sort of concrete examples, but it's something that we tracked on our side as well, and we don't disagree that it may be something that could be problematic. So
A lot of these laws for both emissions from impacting facilities and also the slopes and surfaces, it's based on a lot of different aircraft experiences, aircraft receivers, aircraft performance. So an airport that serves bug smashers, Cessnas will have a different criteria than one that has 747s come into it. So the airport's going to be designed against anticipated traffic. So, and that's where some of these criteria come from. So they're not totally arbitrary. They're based on lots of studies and smart people like at Ohio University and other places looking at aircraft performance and pilot performance responses. So there's actually some thought in it. It's not somebody just kind of flapping their lips and say, this looks good. Although I will admit some of the FCC processes can be that way. Backroom discussions can create lots of law. By the way, I just want to mention, just for fun, how many 7460s have we filed in the history of the firm?
over 120,000, I think. Over 120,000. Yeah. So we have quite a bit of cases at this point now.
So if you have questions, we don't mind, helping you out with just, hey, I want to do this. And we give away a lot of time just to help people out. And that way you remember it's when things are really nasty and you need for real help. So don't hesitate to call us and say, hey, what about this?
Yeah, we're definitely if we think that you need us, like, if you call us and we think that you need us, we'll tell you. But truthfully, if you call us and we look at the project or look at the FA's feedback and say, yeah, you just need to do X, Y, Z, or just ask the FA for this, we'll let you know and we'll send you on your way. There's no sense in bogging you down or you know, obviously going through the whole rigmarole of contracting and all that stuff. If really it's just a quick hour long, you know, fix or something to that effect, but I mean, if it's something where, yeah, it's a pretty big concern, we'll tell you up front that, yeah, this is probably something that you'd want to consider getting us involved in. So. And the last slide actually that I have here is just a snippet from the FAA's OEAAA portal, just their main landing page. There's a section search archives where you can actually look for any old filings in the FAA system. You're really not limited other than just, I think, I want to say maybe it times out like after like 1986 or 1984, anything before then you really can't find or it's not in there, or exceedingly rare that you're going to find it. Nevertheless, the next couple sections are just the FAQs, frequently asked questions for various things. The notice criteria tool that I talked about earlier, if you want to run it, you could click on that link and it'll take you to the tool where you punch in the coordinates and all for your project. And then finally, the last part is just contacts, on airport contacts, off airport contacts. If you have any questions directly for the FAA, they're happy to help you out in that manner as well. Gary,
One
go
other
ahead.
point is many states have aeronautical offices that care about your proposal, and it varies. Some states have none, and others really care about you. I see you propose something to the FAA, you didn't talk to us, our feelings are hurt. And whether they have any regulatory authority or not depends on the state. Anything else, folks?
Yeah, I've got just a couple of comments. Our company over the last, probably decade, we have filed a 7460 on just about every tower that we already have, in addition to the new ones. And the purpose of these has been all over the board, but a lot of it is correcting. We went in and corrected coordinates. When antenna structure registration came along, when in 1997 or so, everybody's out there running around with handheld GPS receivers, trying to figure out what the coordinates of this tower are in NAD 83. And a lot of times, like you said a few minutes ago, you could be a couple of feet off or a couple of 100 feet off, and sometimes they were considerably off. And so we did it. We essentially went back and refiled. And like in Mike Kernan there, in his case, I paid a lot of money for an FAA survey to determine the tower locations, and that was a lot of money. And it's I know that is it's a thing. There's a set of standards that they have to follow. I found a dirty little secret though. I'll share with you guys, and this happened during one of my filings. I was talking to an airspace specialist in the southern region about a tower down in Alabama, and she said that the coordinates that I had come up with were a little bit off, and I'm talking about not a couple of feet, but maybe 20 feet from what she was coming up with. And I asked her, well, where are you getting that? And she said, Google Earth. And I said, seriously? And she said, seriously. She said, we use in this office Google Earth to double check the coordinates of almost anything that gets filed, especially existing structures that would be easily located on Google Earth, where you can look on there and you can see, oh, there's the tower right there. And then they pull those coordinates up. And so from that point forward, I use Google Earth for everything for that purpose, and I've never had anybody question any coordinates. So I can't speak to the accuracy of that, but apparently, at least in some of these FAA district offices, that is a standard that they go by. You got any comments on that?
Well, what I would say is I first acknowledge that 1A surveys, the survey that the FAA asks for, folks, is can be expensive. And so not every project has that ability or affordability to be able to get one of those surveys. So in the absence of that, you can always use your own data, whether it's sourced through Google or elsewhere. What I will tell you is that regardless of whether it's Google Earth data or some other coordinates that are received, the FAA will ask for surveys if you're impacting certain types of procedures. So if there's the perceived impact to a procedure, the FAA will say this concern goes away with a 1A survey. And the reason why is because the surveys attest to certain vertical and horizontal accuracies, as you described. And in the absence of a survey, the FAA is going to apply that penalty to your building. So hypothetically, if you have a 100-foot tall antenna tower and you're under an instrument landing system approach to an airport, the FAA could apply a 20 or 50-foot penalty to that tower, and all of a sudden is now artificially pushing you through that critical surface. Whereas with a survey, you'd still be below that surface. So it's not a bad strategy to file without a survey. Just that, of course, the fly in the ointment is maybe down the road, if you encounter a concern, the FAA may ask for that survey down the road. So, but as a cost savings measure, if you assume for every project you just pull Google Earth coordinates, that may work out for you. But if you're tall enough and close enough to an airport or critical airspace, they may still follow up with that survey. So,
Yeah, my question is more for Chris, actually, in this regard than anything. So when you use that Google Earth point, are you putting the tip of the mouse right at the base
Yes.
of the tower? Just, I mean, as
Yes.
close as you can
Exactly.
dial in. And then if you were going to do a building, say, for example, that's, 100 feet wide or whatever, and it's got to be certain tall, do you have to measure each point of the corner on that? Or if you're putting up a tall tower structure, obviously you go back to the base, I presume, but is any dimensional, side dimensional factors in all that?
So we actually, funny enough, when it comes to building developers, survey or not, we actually tell building developers to essentially take the extent of their building footprint and buffer it out even further and file a greater extent to allow flexibility. Because as long as the container that you file with the FAA is larger than the structure you're going to fit within it, so essentially as long as your as-built building doesn't penetrate that boundary you filed with the FAA, both laterally and vertically, you're fine. So survey or not, if you have a property that you're looking at submitting to the FAA for their review, as long as you're creating a boundary that your building is going to be inside, you could create that footprint and just send it along to the FAA. It may not be the exact dimension of your building, but so long as it's bigger than the dimension of your building, then you're at least conservatively filing the largest extent.
The other comment that I had was about marking and lighting. There have been some changes in recent years. In fact, I think the latest revision of the advisory circular increased the height that you can use, like dual medium intensity lighting systems, and we've really taken advantage of that in our company because paint jobs are really, really expensive, and we found out that in a lot of cases, about a paint job and a half will pay for the lighting change, and then you have no more paint jobs.
Yep.
So we filed quite a few of those. What I've run into in a couple of cases has been either local, neighborhood, whatever objection to flashy things outside their bedroom windows, or in Southern California, light pollution. Why do they worry about light pollution in Southern California? I haven't figured that out yet. But because it's terrible to start with, I guess they don't want you to make it any worse with some little light up on a tower on a hilltop. But anyway, I would just comment that maybe before you go too far down the road with a lighting change, particularly from red lights to white and red medium intensity, you should probably check out those local issues first to be sure that you're not going to run into issues with neighbors or homeowners associations or the local jurisdictions there that might have something to say about that, because you can waste a lot of money before you figure that out.
Yeah. Yeah, and the fix to that or to revert back is not necessarily cheap too if the whole intent was to save money. So any other questions?
Yeah, I have one real quick question maybe. What about removing a tower? What would be the procedures for notification on that?
Yeah, removing a tower, it's actually quite simple, to be perfectly honest. We would alert the FAA specialist that that tower is no longer constructed. And then there is a point of contact that they have in the digital obstacle file office as well, where they would alert them that that structure no longer exists as well. So we would essentially submit one, or you in theory could submit a dismantle notice of that particular structure, and two, the FAA would then coordinate it with another office within the FAA, essentially taking it out of any sort of charts or publications if that's even relevant.
And that's
Gary?
a 7460-1 filing, is it not?
Correct, yeah.
So same form fits multiple tasks. The other thing is, remember, after you have the dismantlement acknowledged by the FAA, if there's an ASR associated with it, you need to go in and file a notice of dismantlement with the FCC, or else it's still out there to bite you. The other ASR gotcha is if the station has changed hands, you gotta make sure that that travels with, it's not an automatic thing. Make sure all the ASRs have the ownership change in them. So two places where you need to let the world know that you've done this.
Gary, can I ask, I have a question for you about that. There are a lot of towers in ASR that don't exist anymore. And the entities that, that filed those originally are long gone. Do you know if there is a mechanism or a way to clean those up? For instance, I have a site in Southern California, Los Angeles area, and if you do an ASR search within 1 kilometer of my site, you'll find my 4 towers plus 3 towers at the exact same site that were there 20 years ago that are no longer present, and that whole entity is gone. Is there a mechanism to clean that up?
Not that I'm aware of. Whoever owns the structure in the FCC world is the one that has the authority to take it down. So I don't know of anything that's official, Sandy. You can go in there and clean things up because you don't own it. You don't have the rights to. It's like somebody say, well, gee, I don't like that radio station. It's been off the air, but they haven't filed a notice of discontinuance of operation. It still exists until the FCC decides something's up. So sorry, no answer for that one. Anything else, folks?
Time commitment. Your guys is part of this. Also, way too much good information. They can't hear. Thank you. I know it's a big time commitment on your part for this, and of course, you gave us a lot more information than we're used to absorbing in a week in an SBE meeting. So I'm kind of like much appreciative. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Anybody else?
Yeah, no problem. Thank you guys for your time.
We appreciate it.
Be good.
Yeah, thank you. Will do. You guys too. Thanks so much.